Hello, Kevin here. Good to see you. Today we're going to take a very brief look at chords and in particular how chords are created, where they come from and how we use them and how they apply to our style of singing. So let's dive straight in, go and have a look at the keyboard. So here we are back at the keyboard again to look at chords this time. A chord is essentially any two or more notes played together. So, for example, two notes played together count as a chord. Two-note chords don't feature really in barbershop singing. We tend to work with triads, that's three-note chords, or four-note chords. A three-note chord, for example, so let's see where these triads and four-note chords come from. If we take our scale, in this case we're going to go right the way back to look at the C major scale. You remember that contained the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and start it all over again. Or Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. In the Western world, we create chords by harmonizing, generally in thirds. And you remember a third was just three note names. So if we take our first note C, for example, and add a third to C, we're going to go up three notes, always counting the C. C, D, E. So the first two notes of our C chord, C, we then want to go up another third because we're harmonizing in thirds, another three notes from the E, 1, 2, 3, takes us to G. So our triad, three note chord, contains the notes C, E, and G. That happens to be a C major chord, which is the root chord in the key of C major. We can do the same with every other note in the scale as well. So if we started with D, go up three notes, that'll take us to F. Go up three notes, that'll take us to A. There we go, D, F and A. Now that actually makes a D minor chord. If I play D major followed by the D minor chord, hopefully that'll help you to hear the difference between a major chord, which is happy, jolly, and the minor chord, which is said to have a sadder feel. So here we go with the major chord, D major. D minor. You hear that difference? Major, minor. Okay, so happy, sad. Okay, so back to our scale. If we started on the third note, E, add a third, G, add another third, B, we have an E minor chord, another of those sad chords. If we then go from F, F, A, C, that's a much happier sounding chord. That's an F major chord. G, you'll notice that really what we're doing is we're taking one note, skipping the next note name, and then skipping the next one. So G will give us the notes G, B and D, which is a G major chord. We then move to A, C, E, it's an A minor chord, and then finally B, D, F. That's quite weird sounding. That's a B diminished chord, and the last chord in a scale is always the diminished chord. It sounds very unsettled and really needs to move somewhere else. So within our scale we have a major chord, a minor chord, another minor chord, major, major, minor, and diminished. I've shown that in the key of C using the scale of C major. We could use any of the other major scales and come up with the same sequence of chords: major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, in any key. Notice also that when we look at harmonizing in thirds, if we come back to our C chord, C is note number 1, E is note number 3, and G is note number 5. So we're playing 1, 3, 5. And that's the makeup of a triad. 1, 3, and 5. It doesn't matter if it's a major or minor triad at this stage. It will still be, if we move to D minor, 1, 3, 5. If we move to G, 1, 3, 5. Those are our triads. If a song is written in the key of C, those are the chords that we would expect to find during the majority of the song, because they work well with the notes from the key. In our singing, of course, we have 4 parts. So when we are singing a triad, where there are only 3 notes, what will happen is that 2 parts will double up and sing the same note, often though an octave apart. So here, for example, if I have G, B and D, I may have another voice singing a lower note than those. So G, B, D. Let's put the basses in on a lower D. There we go. So we now have a 4-note chord: D, G, B, and another D. It's still a G major chord because the notes are G, B, and D. I needn't have used the D as the doubled note. I could use a G. They'll probably have to go up to stay in our ranges. So in this case, the tenors may well have gone up to that note. We could use the B as our doubled note. Take it way down to the bottom end of the bass register. Or way up to the top of the tenor register. We can continue our harmonization into 4 parts though. If we come back to our original C major chord, C, E and G, each one going up in thirds, we can add another third on top, the B note in this case. Now hear the difference in that chord to the original major chord. It's got a lot more subtlety and a lot more colour to it, and that's because we've added the next step in the harmonisation, which is the 7th note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the 7th note is always a bit sounding unstable, really wants to go up to the next note, which is the root note again. So we have C, E, G and B. We can do exactly the same with all of the other chords. And then back to C again. There are a wide variety of seventh chords, many of which will turn up in barbershop music. There is one chord, however, which we find lots and lots and lots of times, and that is what's called the dominant seventh chord. And in the key of C, the dominant seventh chord is G. Lovely sound. It occurs so often in barbershop music, it's often called the barbershop chord. Typically, the dominant seventh chord has a particular function in that it really wants to go back to the root chord. So if we hear G7 and then C, you can hear that's like putting a full stop in a piece of music. It's an ending. And that's one of the things that the dominant seventh chord really likes to do. If we're singing a chord with 4 notes in it, we can share those notes out amongst the 4 parts. So if we take our G7 chord, for example, that would naturally be bass, bari, lead, tenor. Doesn't have to be though. We could play the chord, let's say, where we're going to have the bari singing the G. We'll put the bass down lower and get a B all the way down here. So the chord would be bass, bari, lead, tenor. We could, when we are singing a chord with 4 notes, clearly we can spread those 4 notes across the 4 parts. Let's say bass, bari, lead, tenor. We don't need to arrange them in that order. We could take the B, for example, for the bari note, and play that in the bass, and that would mean perhaps that the bari would then sing the G note. So we'd have bass, bari, lead, tenor. We could take the F from the tenors and give it to the baris down here, and give the tenors a G, a higher note. So now the chord is much more spread out. Bass, bari, lead, tenor. Yeah, you hear how each different version of the chord, the way in which we organise the notes, gives us a different sound versus our original. We can even give the tenor the root note, the G. Let's give the leads the D. We'll have the basses on the B. And what does that leave? That leaves us with the baris to go on F. There we go. All of these different options are called chord voicings, and they affect the way the music sounds. We could, in this case, give our leads the root note. Let's give the tenors the 7th. That's a nice wide gap. We can give the basses the B, and then the baris the D. That's a nice full sounding chord, partly because the three main notes of the chord, the G, B and the D, all occur very close together. This is close harmony singing after all, and that gives a really rich sound, with then the icing on the cake being the note of the tenors way up here. And because the tenor note is so far away from the rest of the chord, it really sings out over the top of the chord. That's the fairy dust on top of the chord for us. So hopefully you can see from this that there are many ways of putting the notes together that make up a chord. We can share those notes amongst all of the parts and create different sounds as a result. So there you go. That's the end of our quick look at the basics of chords. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.